Hello and welcome to this week's StatsBomb Podcast with me, James York.
You're listening to the StatsBomb Football Podcast.
One half a step too late or too early, and you don't quite make it. 1/2 second too slow, too fast, you don't quite catch it. The inches we need are everywhere around us.
Welcome to the StatsBomb Football Podcast. I am not James York. I am Seth Partnow, Director of North American Sports at StatsBomb, and I am here with Ted Knutson.
Hi, I'm the CEO of StatsBomb. Longtime StatsBomb podcast listeners might know me as the guy who usually gets us into trouble in the other football space.
As well as Matt Edwards.
Hi, I'm Matt Edwards. I'm the head of football analysis here at StatsBomb, and just excited to talk about a little bit of football and analytics on the podcast.
Seth, I'm offended for Matt. You left off Coach Matt Edwards. It's like
the coach Matt Edwards. Yes.
Thank you. Let's
yes.
give people their proper titles here.
Yes.
You're Captain Podcast, and
So for people who are maybe less familiar with Matt, since he speaks publicly less than either Ted or I do, give us a little bit of your background in football, Matt.
Awesome. So I played in college. I played at BYU tight end and had a great experience there. I grew up with a grandpa who was a football coach and just loved football and knew that I wanted to be in football. And so started out my career coaching. Was a graduate assistant coach, coached at a Division III school in Virginia, where when you're at that level, you kind of have to do everything. So coached receivers, coached offensive line, recruiting coordinator. I was the interim head coach for a little bit, janitor part-time as we were going. So I had a good experience there. And then my last job in coaching was actually at the University of Virginia, where I transitioned into more of a data role as the director of football analytics. And I was there for 5 seasons and had a great time there.
So you're a perfect person to talk about kind of the way we wanted to kick this podcast series off, which is to talk a little bit about the development and application of data to football. And your coaching career has kind of spanned the era of nothing beyond sort of play-by-play and hand-charted stuff to what we have now. So can you sort of describe how your relationship with data and football has sort of evolved over that time from your playing career till now?
Yeah, definitely. Coaches have always used data of some degree, right? They're always looking at tendencies and, a good example is like run percentages, right? And all of that is backed up by data. So in the past, what would happen is a coach, graduate assistant, quality control, somebody would have to go in and tag that data. So as a player, I would get information about, okay, this team blitzes 25% of the time, they run man 60% of the time, whatever the numbers were. And it was some pretty high level information, but we would get a bit of a statistical breakdown. Then as time passes, you see a little bit more data come into the space. The NFL has had tracking data get introduced. And so you go from, probably about 10 years ago with some really basic information to now where you have the physical location of every player 30 times per second in our tracking data and all sorts of interesting data science models that are built on top of this. And so you get all sorts of information that's out there. And so the idea of then we have all this data, how are we going to utilize it? Each team is doing that a little bit differently, but just the sheer volume of data and volume of information that's out there is mind-blowing, really, and so much different than what was around 10 years ago.
I think we're at the point where, Ted, you obviously are one of the, if I can blow a little bit of smoke, one of the sort of the founding fathers of applied soccer analytics. And certainly I have a background in basketball. And I think where we are in the development of football analytics is the sort of the behind the scenes debate is over. In terms of people recognize this stuff is useful and are using it at increasing scale, but sort of the public debate, as has been the case in other sports, sort of lags behind. So I think we're seeing a lot of the same objections, and as they kind of continue to get overcome, So, analogizing to soccer, where would you say we are kind of in that process?
Yeah, we're pretty early on that curve. One of the reasons why I started developing the data spec back in 2020, toward sort of the tail end of the year, was that I was seeing all these arguments about, should they go for it, and 2-point conversions and stuff like that. And I was like, okay, well, these are public arguments now, which means that the probabilities are at least being calculated. And the funny thing is, that's the public argument, and that's the thing that gets all the noise that people can argue about, because American airtime and sports media is so oriented on what can we argue about. But the reality is, once you start seeing that type of conversation, the thing that you really care about is players, right? Because that's your biggest cost center, it's your biggest improvement center. And so what you care about then is a large scale of how do we find better players, how do we find players at a discount in positions that matter for us, not necessarily matter for other teams, which is totally different as well. Different types of schemes need different types of players. And so at that point, we looked at it and said, okay, this sport in particular is ripe for a better quality data set. And when I built the soccer data set in StatsBomb back in, say, 2017, 18, we were looking at what can we do that gives you better gambling data and better team data in the same way. That's what we did in the football space, the American football space. The thing that we found quite difficult, though, was that you have a really huge kind of barbell distribution or bifurcation in the market, where you've got a top tier of NFL that's really smart and taking on 3, 4, 5, 6 data providers at one time in some cases, and then you have the other tier in college, where something like probably 98, 99% of the teams have almost nothing in the data space. And we'll talk about one of those in a bit. One of the reasons why we're doing the podcast now is because it feels like this is the time where college starts to change too. And the whole narrative around how analytics, data, football operates, and also the need for people who are talented and qualified to do this is about to take off. And that's probably this year. That's my guess, but it'll happen for the next decade.
So I have a theory on sort of this adoption curve, and it deals with the level and kind of granularity of the data we're dealing with. And it seems like, with the possible exception of baseball, which is for a number of reasons kind of easier to address from a statistical standpoint, because the whole game is kind of a statistical standpoint. The sort of the early public arguments almost come out of economics and statistics, and you're dealing with the level of aggregates and play-by-play and stuff like that. And the easy objection there, and it's a powerful one, I think, is okay, how does that translate on the field, on the court, on the ice, wherever? And when you start to get into the granular data that then starts to let you see on a play-by-play basis, on a player-by-player basis, on a scheme basis, what each player is doing and how well you're doing it, now you can actually talk about using this information in the language of the sport itself.
The hardest thing to do when we were first designing this, especially from a platform perspective, and we have StatsBomb IQ that's designed to let analysts and coaches be able to use the data more easily to gain insight, right? But the hardest thing of wrapping your head around is just how insanely contextual American football is. And basketball kind of got to that extent at some point when you started to be able to take motion motifs and break it down into different types of plays, and what do they do out of this set and what do they do out of that set. And I could see Seth's face wincing on this one. He's like, small sample size theater, this doesn't mean anything, what's the lineup look like, oh my god. But the reality is, American football fucking started there. It started as everything matters with context. And so when you look at it from that perspective, that's one reason why the coach space has been so dominant for such a long time. Coaches have a lot of this stuff that they pre-built into their matrix of this is how I coach, this is how I analyze the game. But what happens when you get into the space of all of college and all of the NFL and recruitment and portal and potentially recruiting high school kids and looking at physical data and stuff like that is too much for anybody to look at. And that's where data and tools really start to play into this. And this is where, the best teams in the NFL are making huge headway, and we'll talk about those in just a bit, versus the rest. And this is where the college teams are really going to also make huge headway, because the transfer portal hit them right in the face about 3 years ago. And they have most of those teams have nothing that they can do with the portal other than scramble every time it happens. When you're prepared and you understand what the landscape of all the players looks like, which is what data helps you do, you can make really good, really fast decisions in a way that you couldn't do before.
One of the things that I think is really interesting about football in relation to soccer and basketball and some of the experience that you two have is that football really is more similar to baseball, and that there's really delineated, this is a play, this is everything that happened on the play. Then the next one goes, this is your other play, to where you can do some really good analysis based on your play-by-play information. And so that's where a lot of the initial stuff has been, is at the play level. And we'll have plenty of time to talk more in our podcast about all the different types of data that we have at StatsBomb and we're collecting and other teams are using. But the really the next frontier, as we've seen at the NBA, NFL, really in multiple other sports, is the tracking data and the eventing data that we collect is it gives you another level of analysis below the play-by-play data, which is kind of you have different modes of analysis. Your play-by-play is kind of like an easy mode. Your event data is kind of your medium, and then when you get to tracking, it's really the hard mode for analysis. And you can see what is being done at the different levels. And again, we'll have plenty of time to talk about that later in this podcast and others as we're going on. But it really is a sport that fits analysis really well. And I think that is a misconception that I hope we can help kind of get people to move past as well.
Yeah, the reality is that on a per team basis, the big college programs and all the NFL have more analysts than almost any other sport. That's just the fact of it. And part of that's money. But when you walk into a room and there's 6 defensive analysts, you walk to the other side, there's 6 offensive analysts. Like that's more than I can remember in most other sports. Maybe Seth can talk about the NBA space at some point. But he's like frowning and shaking his head because we got a video podcast here now all of a sudden. But no, it's outside of baseball, where when somebody wins a title, you get 30 or 40 people in the analytics and research space that are on the field for the trophy shot. American football has a ton of analysts. It's just how they use information and how they start to adjust to a bigger, broader, more detailed data set that has yet to trigger.
And I think it's important to know that you mentioned earlier about teams making huge headway, and they're not making huge headway with big, eureka discoveries, because they have all this information. They have all these people, crunching data to come up with every little edge they can. I think we're coming off a Super Bowl, which, you almost literally cannot get closer than the Super Bowl was. And the impact of those small edges can be so large. It's the difference between going to Disney World and not in this case. And I think that it's cliche to say it's a game of inches, but it really is. And the buildup of those small edges over time is how you win. Obviously, Ted, with your background in the gambling space, you don't win because you have a stone cold lock on this game. You win over time because you're winning 58% of your wagers instead of 56. Or something of that order.
Yeah, and poker players have the same sort of thing. Sam Hinkie has an aphorism that I kind of stole, is people always overestimate what you can do in a month or even a year, but they underestimate what you can do in a decade. And there's some elements of this that are early mover. If you're not on the train right now, you're missing the compounding benefits of everybody else. And in certain cases, you can hire people to be able to do that. But if you go into a new team, you're starting from scratch in a lot of ways if they're not using any sort of data. So you've got to build the data engineering pipeline. You've got to build this. You've got to build that. You've got to have people around the shop that know how to have the conversation, even engage with the data. But the fact of the matter is, when these teams do engage with the data, they never come back. It's not a space where they're like, oh yeah, we're going to give it all up. That doesn't happen in a sport. And I think one of the interesting things that we've seen in other sports is that the teams that usually invest for real early tend to get compounding games for quite a long time. Maybe it's time to stop into talking about the NFL teams that have led the way with this, because I think that's a particularly interesting place to start. And because we're kind of talking as this is an intro podcast to getting people on board, maybe it's a good spot to also talk about some of these teams and where they're at. So when we look at the NFL teams that have been investing in data and analytics for a long time, you see teams that appear in the conference finals and potentially the Super Bowl on a regular basis. Now, it doesn't happen every year because, as Seth said, like, it's a tough game. Injuries happen. It's difficult to win. You know, you a 60% chance to win in the NFL is pretty good. A 75% chance is almost unheard of outside of the top teams for the worst teams, and that doesn't happen in the playoffs. But looking at the standings from just this last year, right? We know the Bills have been investing in this for quite a long while. The Dolphins at some level have invested in this in the past. Sometimes they change personnel. The Ravens are one of the sort of flag bearers for this type of stuff, as are the 49ers. Now, the Ravens were particularly interesting the last couple of years because one of the things that they overcame was a huge raft of injuries across a lot of their different starters. And now they had a bit of luck, but last year they had too many injuries. One of the ways that you overcome having injury risk, a depth of other personnel that are good enough to keep the ship going. And if you look at the Ravens, the only way you can do that is by doing better in the 4, 5, 6, and 7th round picks. Like some Brock Purdy guy happened to be there. If you don't spike your first round quarterback, but you get somebody that's good enough in the 7th to be able to carry you to the Super Bowl, there's probably a little less luck in that and a little more skill. Not to say that, you know, they did everything right or that they didn't value him correctly, but the fact they drafted him at all and he was there on the squad and the roster, so that speaks to Shanahan's benefit, but also speaks to these teams that are investing in analytics, having little edges across their whole set of recruitment, maybe in free agency as well, and how that accumulates over the years. You don't screw up your roster as much in years -3, -2, -1. Your cap space gets a little bit better. You have more flexibility to go for it when you feel that the team is right.
Yeah, the example from the Niners is really good there, where you're talking about teams that, you know, they have made a decision about, you know, trading away first round picks to make draft picks. You know, the whole roster building, roster management side of analytics is wild, and you know, we will definitely get a chance to talk about that more. You know, a team that
Matt,
you
I
didn't
want to pick
mention.
your brain for a second. I want to stop you and pick your brain though. We're not just talking about the NFL, we're talking about college too. Now, what happens in college now versus what used to happen before in the portal and managing that sort of roster recruitment personnel group, right? Because you really care about the kids that are here right now and you want to keep your best of them on. So like you kind of need to push them out there into the forefront, give them more reps. But then like you've got to worry about the other guys that might come in. Like how has that changed everything? Because I think that's an interesting thread that you have some insight on.
Yeah, it's totally different than it used to be, right? You would recruit your high school players and you would replenish your team through the high school. So kind of if you're thinking about an NFL team, it's almost exclusively through the NFL draft, right? That is how college teams were structured. You would get an occasional grad transfer. If you got an undergrad transfer, they would have to sit out a year. So it would be really difficult to kind of plan on how you would build your roster. So you would spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, we have, you know, 4 scholarship quarterbacks. That means we're going to take one from high school every year and just kind of keep that one a year. They'll be here for 4 years, then they'll graduate. You know, each position had a certain number, and it was always, how are we going to fill that? If you had something weird where you would have an injury, that's where you would maybe go get a grad transfer to kind of plug a hole for a year or two. But now you're looking at teams that are getting, you know, 50 new players a year, 35 transfers a year, where it's much more fluid and it can be overwhelming. You know, as I mentioned before, I coached in college and I have a lot of friends who are still coaching and people that I knew and talking to them, a lot of times they're saying it is overwhelming, the difference that it has happened over the past 2 seasons, where you have to now recruit your own players to stay on the team so that they don't enter the transfer portal. You have to recruit other people that are in the transfer portal, and suddenly there's 1,000 players that you can recruit on one day. When the transfer portal opens, you have to still recruit high school players. And so the NFL is structured in a manner that allows for better flow of how that happens. The NFL draft happens at a certain time and free agency happens at a certain time. But in college, it's the season ends, You have to recruit your own players. The transfer portal's open, and early signing day is within 2 weeks of the end of the season.
Yeah,
and
when Seth and I were at Miami, sort of interning ourselves to learn how to do this, like they were losing dudes off of their special teams because like they were just like, yeah, I'm gonna hop in the portal, and so I'm not gonna play anymore. And it's just like you can't even plan to have like a full first team of special teams there to be able to do it. But I think the thing that we saw this year in the portal was you saw more sort of 5-star caliber dudes just pop in over and over again off of good teams. Like, how often would an Ohio State potentially lose a starting quarterback to anywhere else unless they weren't very good? But like Ohio State was pretty good last year is what I thought.
Yeah, it was wild to see who's going in the portal like you're talking about, where they're going. It's a crazy game, and talking to people, the structure around how teams are analyzing these players and organizing their data is really kind of behind in what has happened. They're trying to catch up, and so we'll get a chance to talk more about some of our tools and how teams can use it. But data really is taking off in the recruiting area at this point in college.
I think we'd have to acknowledge the elephant in the room that is NIL, and I think that over time, the teams that are able to better allocate those resources in the transfer portal are probably the teams that are going to maintain that budget. I think you can shear a sheep a number of times, only skin it once. I don't think it takes will take that many big outlays to a quarterback who ends up not even playing for a given donor to sort of tighten up the purse strings. So
exactly, and I think the thing that the data does, and the thing that Matt's talking about, is it's so chaotic. Data helps you organize the chaos at least a little bit to have some sort of signal out of the noise. That's that's a Nate Silver book, but it's also like literally a job that you have to do. And almost nobody is doing that job well in the college space right now. And they need to get a handle on it. When you give them good enough data, good enough tools, like you can do it. Seth's another good example there. Like in college basketball, there are 330 teams that are out there. So many different players that you could take a look at. You're not going to scout all 330. You might not even scout even half of the teams that are there. Like the only chance and then you're not including the internationals, etc. Like your experience in organizing this stuff from the early days of basketball. Like how did you even start with this, and like how do you feel this fits into the football space?
I was fortunate enough to not have to worry about the player pool entering sort of and moving across the college space, because the sort of relevant player pool any given year from an NBA standpoint is sort of much smaller than that. And so one of the ways you use the data on the college players is to in basketball, and I think football has done pretty well in this as well. But the very top prospects, they are pretty well identified at a pretty early age. But occasionally, frequently really, a player who is sort of unheralded pops up. I mean, the example I have of this, if we can dip into basketball, is early in his freshman year, there was a guy who was in the top 5 in our first run of a draft model named Demetrius Morant. And it was like, who is this guy? And he's had some off-court issues, but I mean, I think that knowing early on that, Ja Morant is someone we want to know about because he's probably an NBA player. It's less common to admit more players into the pool. More valuable is kind of excluding players from the pool. One of the guys, and we have to be sort of humble about the extent of what we can do, is I think from a metric standpoint, Josh Allen was not super well thought of based on his college performance, and obviously he's turned that around. At the same time, as a team in bulk, yes, some players with that profile will make it. My philosophy has always been, I'll let someone else take that bet. And I'm fine missing if a player of an archetype that has a poor track record makes it, because the 19 that I hit on will overwhelm the one I missed on.
Exactly, and this also speaks to you only have so much confidence about how complicated human players are and how they'll do in different spaces. We have a friend who used to work for the Kings that valued Luka Doncic very highly, but could not get his management grouping to value him as highly as they thought they deserved. Turns out Luka was a pretty good player. But there are plenty of other ones where he'll talk about like, yeah, we had that guy much higher and he washed out. And human potential is difficult to assess, and human future performance is difficult to assess. These guys often have to live like monks. They have to make all the good choices. They also, you have to create an environment for them to make better choices. Tom Brady and his avocado ice cream and stuff like that. Like, give yourself a little bit back so that you can have more willpower to be, an Adonis or a Dunkin' Donuts spokesman, should you want to be that in the future. I think also the thing that gets lost inside all this stuff is on the daily, there's always too much work to do. Always, always, always. And so can you create more time for your coaches and analysts to do smart work as opposed to doing the dumb grunt work? And once you do, like, that just rolls up and aggregates like magic as well. Matt, I think it's probably a good time for us to start to walk through how you've applied data in the past. So those of you who don't know Matt, he worked as the director of football analytics for University of Virginia, had a very interesting offensive-minded coach at the time. I think they set a record in the last season that they were there around kind of offensive points scored, and for University of Virginia, which is not a football school, let me tell you, lived in Charlottesville for a while. They had quite a good record and well thought of at the time. But Matt kind of built this stuff from the ground up. And so he actually is one of those kind of quiet pioneers that you look at and say, dude, you did a lot of hustle, and you did it across 3 different major areas: opponent scout, self-scout, transfer portal. Let's hop into those to talk about, like, the big areas that you focused on initially and how teams are going to want to push this forward.
Yeah. So awesome. Charlottesville is great. Give a shout out to Charlottesville there. Two of the 3 here have spent some time in a great city. So I think that the biggest thing for me when I was initially starting out was I wanted to help make our coaches' lives easier. So Ted, like you were talking about, they do a lot of, whether it's film watching to get information, spend some time tagging film of specific things that they're looking at. With data, you can automate a lot of those things. And so I would talk to our coaches and say, all right, you special teams coordinator, what are you looking for? What is something that I can help take off of your plate? Often, quarterback coach, what is something that you are looking for defensively when you're analyzing film? Is that something that I can create a report for you? And a lot of times there were things that coaches would say, hey, this is my weekly schedule. We have GAs and analysts tag some stuff Sunday. That leaves me a little bit of information that I tag. I look at film this way. Wednesday, I get to this information. And, there's a very specific example that we played University of Miami that season. They had a receiver that was very particular about where he lined up. As part of their film watching, they got that information Wednesday and were able to add a few things to the game plan. Say, all right, well, he lines up exclusively on the right-hand side. What does that mean? Where is he getting targeted? How are we going to utilize that? And that's some of the stuff that I would be able to then say, hey, I know you look for stuff like this. Let me create reports that help you get this opponent information earlier in the week. So you can have that Sunday or Monday and create your game plan from there instead of having to wait till Wednesday and trying to add it after.
So one of the funny things that Seth and I encountered is we were in the other set of rooms when Matt was doing that research. We were on Miami's, or not on Miami's, but in and around Miami staff at the time. And one of the questions that Coach Diaz asked was, he was like, I want to know that dude's route tree on 3rd and long. And he was talking about a tight end that had a particularly interesting sort of size and shape about him. He seemed to be built from a tree. And one of the things that we listened to there was, oh, that's actually something we can do inside of a product, right? We can go ahead and say, yeah, anytime you want to know the configuration of a particular receiver and what his route tree looks like from an alignment or from, a down and distance or from a time perspective or from a personnel perspective, like we can actually build that into product. And so we were listening to these types of things to be able to do that. Meanwhile, Seth was out there beating the offensive analysts at chess and irritating everybody in the OC room. And that was a bigger problem, but I can't overcome that.
I've yet to play Seth in chess. I'm not good, so he would definitely beat me, but I'm interested.
It was an accident. I didn't mean it.
It wasn't poker. It's poker when he means it.
There was no money on the line, so it was just for fun. The interesting thing there is a lot of what you're describing doing is a word we use is automation, automating a lot of the sort of the breakdowns, the cut-ups, because any of these questions that are getting asked can be answered from what's there already. The problem is every time you ask them, it's another hour, 2-3 hours for a GA, for an analyst to collate the information in just the right way you want to do it. And the sort of the 1.0 level of analytics is almost the CEO of former CEO of Second Spectrum, was a pioneering company in basketball, described a lot of what they're doing as fancy counting. And I think that's a lot of collating the information in this way allows for the kinds of questions that both of us were getting, or all of us were getting asked during that week of prep. If you can answer each of those questions in a minute and 3 keystrokes versus if it's an hour and a half, just think of the multiplier effect you have on the amount of kind of questions you can ask and answer quickly during the course of a week. Now, most of them will actually not be a thing. But if you can increase the volume of like smart questions you're asking, your likelihood of finding that thing that gets you that inch, the thing that turns a drive that stalls out and ends in a field goal versus getting into the end zone. Like, how many games would that swing? So I think that's really where a lot of the power is.
Well, and it's 3 hours or 10 hours or 20 hours, because some of these things are huge amounts of work that are self-collected. And this is also one area where AI comes into play as well. So I used to make fun of AI as like, anytime somebody says the words AI in a sports marketing presentation, I know that it's snake oil. Like it's a lock that is snake oil. But that has changed over the last 5 years, not least because we started investing in it at some point. But the causation was the other way around. We invested in it because we could see kind of the utility of it. And that utility started to come into play not only in building tracking data and physical metrics from computer vision, which we have a great product that we do that on, but we also started to use it to categorize things like routes. And once you start to categorize routes, we had a couple of coaches. We always take our data and we investigate it, right? We want to figure out, is this good? Is it not good? And we started to compare it to NGS data, but then we also started to compare it to actual coaches' information about what routes they were. So we had a couple of coaches go through offenses they knew and tell us what the routes were. And then we had the AI models and the machine learning models that had categorized that. We compared the two. And against one of the competitors, we were about 8% better, which is early on in the data curve. When the data curve gets larger and larger, this starts to go through and you get better information. And so you get more precise information, you get more detailed information. It gets more secure as to what it knows, more accurate. So the AI is going to not only save people time in kind of categorizing routes, but then it'll go into plays. It'll do coverages, it'll do schemes. And it's kind of interesting, like you'll be able to do some predictive elements potentially around like what these teams probably will run in this particular situation going forward. Maybe that plays into some of the sideline stuff that's available these days as well. I'm intrigued. That's a little dream casting stuff. But right now, the things we're talking about and the things that StatsBomb do are legit.
Yeah, you see the college teams are starting to allow technology on the sideline. I think the ACC just yesterday approved that video technology. And so the kind of the future of being able to have coaches on the sideline have a little bit more technology and information. I'm really interested to see where that goes. But I think the more forward thinking these teams can be, like we're talking about, the different edges that they can get, whether it's in decision making, in a 4th down overtime situation, or strictly of how you're setting up your team. The edges are everywhere, and I think that plays into what we're talking about with the inches. It's inches on the football field, but also like, let's say you are recruiting a player and you can use the StatsBomb tools to get some physical metrics of this player's top speed is actually 21.5 miles per hour instead of 21.3. Like that 0.2 miles per hour will give you inches on go routes that help create more explosive plays, and closing speed and all this stuff is there are inches everywhere, and the data that we have is going to be able to help people make better
it takes
decisions.
time to incorporate this stuff, though. It takes time to understand it and to begin to build a verbiage around it, and that's why teams need to start now. And if they think that, oh yeah, well we're going to be the headliners in this, they need to look no further than how much comes out of University of Michigan or doesn't. But we know people who've been alongside of it. They built a structure there from the 49ers base ages ago, where Hardball was previously, and they invested as one of the earliest teams in the NFL. And then University of Michigan apparently was one of the biggest users, almost at an NFL level, of data and analytics in the college space.
I think that's a good point to sort of start to wrap for this first episode, where we've talked a lot about almost table setting about why and how to data. Obviously, where we are now in the calendar, the next big thing is we're entering the height of NFL draft season, and I think that in the next couple episodes we're going to talk a lot about how we might examine different positions, how we might value different positions. Ted mentioned earlier in the pod the sort of the tension between sort of a universal ability or value of a player versus the situational in-scheme value of a player. And that's a fascinating thing across sports. Like, he's a good player, but not for us is a common way of kind of taking a guy off the board. And I think that we have a lot of interesting stuff we can talk about in terms of identifying both how good players are, as well as how they reach that level of elite level production that gets them an NFL spot, and what teams that might indicate they're right for, and what teams maybe not are such a good fit.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm going to have a couple of articles that are coming out as well about the NFL draft. So there'll be some cross-pollination between our podcast and articles. So we'll have a lot of content out there about what we're doing at StatsBomb. And specifically, in some player analysis for the NFL draft. But just really excited to be able to talk with you two about, football analytics. I love talking about it. So excited to see where this goes.
For the visualization nerds, you can also expect us to start to preview some physical metrics radar alongside some performance metrics there. For those of you who have been following some of the social, you can catch some new functionality that we put out recently, where we're taking the tracking data, also the event data, the video, and player highlighting, and combining those together for any position. So you see a bit around linebackers. If you looked at Seth's thing yesterday, you'll see a very large man running 30, 40 yards down the field as part of a blocking engagement, and then just sort of, looking for more people to hit. It's exciting, and we are at the moment where things are going to change. It's the inflection point, and so that's why we spun this up and got it rolling.
Well, thanks a lot for joining us. Look for more episodes on a weekly basis here on StatsBomb Football. And for Ted and Matt, thanks for listening, and we will talk to you again soon. Welcome to the StatsBomb American Foot. Fuck.
Have you ever been on a podcast?
Leave it in.
Keep that one.